Good evening. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of this new unit at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And we are delighted all of you could be here for the third event in the school's 2018-2019 series on polarization and civil disagreement, confronting America's civic crisis. The series includes individual speaker events and interviews, dialogue events, and in February we will have a two-day conference. The school is co-sponsoring the series with two ASU partners, the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. This series on polarization and remedies for it is the sequel to our 2017-2018 series on free speech and intellectual diversity in higher education in American society. We are editing the many presentations from that inaugural series into a published book. And as you can see, we are happy to be partnering again with Arizona PBS on recording all the events in this year's series as they did for the inaugural series. Those episodes air locally and then are archived on the PBS website. Last year's series was entitled Free Speech, Challenge of Our Times. Everything we do in the series last year and this year is also archived and available on the Skettle website. Nearly 4,000 members of the ASU and broader Phoenix communities joined us for events last year, so we ask you to spread the word about this year's events. There's a series of flyers and information on tables and racks outside. The aim of all this is to provide a forum for civil disagreement and debate, and I'm glad that we have with us tonight colleagues from other departments and units at ASU and also members of the Phoenix community. So just a few words from me about the mission of this new school and the larger rationale for this series, and then I'll introduce our distinguished speaker. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership aims to restore the connection between liberal education and civic education in the university, then to undertake civic education with our broader community. Our students discuss great works of civic, economic, philosophical, religious, and political thought in our courses. Then we organize this series and other speaker events to promote robust but also civil discussion of academic and civic issues. The intellectual and civic polarization behind the free speech controversy on many American campuses prompted us to formulate for this year a sequel on the broader issue of polarization, the angry disagreements, the self-sorting into parties and schools of thought in which we demonize those with whom we disagree, often called polarization or negative partisanship. Because the polarized and compartmentalized intellectual climate on many campuses is both a symptom and a cause of America's broader polarization, we think educators ought to address this deterioration in higher education and in America's capacity for self-governance. In the school's undergraduate program, we address all of these issues by offering a major and a minor, featuring courses on great works of civic and economic thought. We supplement that with broader experiences about leadership and statesmanship, including internships, experiential leadership and service courses, and again, public events like this, all as a foundation for understanding and then practicing leadership in 21st century America and our globalized world. And in general, we think a return to some fundamental ideas and debates might provide a broader perspective and a calming perspective in our polarized and divided times. That brings us to our speaker this evening to continue the high-level discussion of polarization and civility in the series thus far. First with Jonah Goldberg, then Mark Lilla. We're delighted to have a leading writer and public intellectual address the religious dimension of our civic disintegration. Ross Douthat studied history at Harvard University, and then his career as a journalist and writer mostly has been at The Atlantic as a senior editor and blogger, and since 2009 at the New York Times as an opinion columnist. His column appears every Wednesday and Sunday. He's also a film critic for the National Review, a writer in residence at the Elm Institute in New Haven, Connecticut, and this semester I learned he's co-teaching a course on conservative thought at Yale Law School. His books include Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and most recently, earlier, I guess in 2017, to Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Our format this evening begins with Mr. Douthat offering prepared remarks, and then in part two, as you can see from the chairs, I'll be joined by Professor Tracy Fessenden of ASU School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies for a joint interview, post some follow-up questions. And then in part three, Ross will take questions from the audience. We invite everyone to stay afterward for a reception. Please join me now in welcoming Ross Douthat on One Country, Three Faiths, America's Real Religious Divide.
Thank you, sir. Great to have you. I think these are closer to semi-prepared remarks, so we'll see how they go. Thank you all so much for coming. It's really a delight to be here in such a warm and sunny climate, and a delightful place with so many exciting Senate attack ads on the television in my hotel. I really feel like I'm in the heart of American polarization. But I'm very grateful to the university and SCELT, which is a wonderful acronym that conjures up, I feel like, Viking raids or something. It sounds like something you get a weregeld and then you trade it for SCELT or something. So maybe not. But anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I am indeed going to try and talk about the state of American religion and give you a kind of sketch of how I see the American religious landscape in this particular moment, and how that landscape then contributes to disturbances, disagreements, controversies, and conflicts. And I'll probably try and end with some wild speculations about possible ways that this three-part division that I'm going to propose could radically change over the next 25 to 100 years. But usually when I talk publicly about religion, I try and start with some personal anecdotes to try and give you a sense of my own religious background, because I think that's always helpful to understand where someone's analysis is coming from. So I grew up in southern Connecticut, in New Haven. My parents were sort of upper middle class professionals who had both gone to Ivy League schools, who attended an Episcopal church, and were sort of, part of a kind of secularizing upper middle class that was loosely attached to the Protestant main line in the 1970s and 1980s. And in the normal course of events, I probably would have become a slightly less religious, fairly conventionally liberal inhabitant of the Acela corridor. But God or Providence or some darker power had other plans for us. And in particular, my mother had various mysterious health problems, chemical allergies and sensitivities, various ailments and inflammations that medicine at that time was sort of incompetent to solve. And so she ended up wandering into stranger pastures in search of cures. So we spent a lot of time shopping at health food stores and eating health food diets long before Whole Foods made all of that incredibly cool. Because she had chemical allergies, we would, now if you go to the grocery store or the supermarket, there will be an aisle of Tide and other detergents that are listed as free of perfumes and dyes, which are basically for people like my mom. But there was none of that in the 1980s, and so we would order strange, unscented shampoos from companies with names like Granny's Old Time Shampoo, which I'd then have to explain to friends when they came over for sleepovers why they were expected to wash their hair with this strange elixir. So we did that, and then also my mother had a friend who said, well, you're sick and you can't get better, why don't you come to a faith healing service that's being held in a high school auditorium in southern Connecticut? And I don't know if there were any church-state issues raised by these healing services. Maybe some of the constitutional law experts, we can address that later on. But there was a woman with the extremely appropriate name of Grace, who had had a kind of near-death experience and come back from that with some sort of charismatic gift. And she had a band that played with her. They were called Grace and Vessels of Christ. And she was the kind of person who would walk around a room like this one and point to people in the aisle and say, you have an ailment in your back, or you have a problem in your leg. And then she'd call them out into the aisle and pray for them, and they would fall down. And my mother thought this was extremely bizarre and alienating, and she was, a Yale-educated, serious person, and she wasn't going to have any of this. And then Grace pointed to her and correctly identified pain she was suffering from, and my mom very reluctantly got up and walked into the aisle, and Grace prayed for her, and my mother fell down on the floor and spent the next hour having some kind of ecstatic religious experience that basically redirected a large part of the course of my childhood. And from that point on, my family went on a kind of tour, you might say, of much of American Christianity. So we had been Episcopalian and we continued to go to mainline Protestant churches, but we sort of fell into charismatic and evangelical and Pentecostalist worlds, even as I continued to otherwise, attend a sort of nice liberal private school in the outskirts of New Haven and have a sort of normal seeming life. And then on the weekends, I would go and watch my parents speak in tongues. Totally normal. And then when I was about 16 years old, just to complete the circle, we obviously had to end by converting to, what else? Roman Catholicism. So we were never Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, although I think we went to at least one Jehovah's Witness service, and basically we covered most of American Christianity in about 11 years in my childhood. So that's sort of my religious story, such as it is. And I went from that childhood into a career in journalism where everything in coverage of religion and writing about religion was defined by the polarization that is sort of the umbrella for this lecture series. Right versus left, secular versus religious conservatives versus religious liberals, new atheists versus traditional believers, and so on. And, I started in journalism in the Bush era, when all of my liberal friends were afraid of a looming theocracy. And then I passed into the Obama era when all of my conservative friends thought an intolerant secularism was going to carry it all before it. And through all of this, I always had this sense from the sheer weirdness of my childhood that American religion was too big and strange a topic to be encompassed by just sort of two categories, left and right, liberal and conservative, and so on. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to blow your minds by suggesting that there are three categories instead. Totally radical concept. But before I get to those categories, again, since we're talking about polarization, I want to start with an argument that there was in the past a kind of real religious center in American life, and a kind of soft religious consensus. And this center was associated originally with Protestant Christianity, with Congregationalists and Anglicans at the beginning, and then expanding to include Methodists and Baptists, and then at a certain point, after a few minor disturbances, expanding to include Roman Catholics and Jews as well. And so by the time you reached the post-World War II period, the 1940s and 1950s, when there was a big religious revival in America, lots of people coming home from the war and starting families and going back to church and moving out to the suburbs and building new churches and so on, there was a sense not only of revival, but of a real convergence in American Christianity, a sense that the different strands of Christianity, Catholicism, mainline Protestantism, evangelicalism, even the black church, always sort of this sort of hidden part of American Christianity, were converging on a religious center, were in dialogue and argument with each other. It was the era of Billy Graham and Reinhold Niebuhr and Fulton Sheen and Martin Luther King, all of whom were figures who were engaged in public argument, who were defined by serious engagement with Christian theology, and none of whom were seen as sort of captives to one particular partisan coalition, one particular partisan cause. All of them were obviously had enemies and were involved in arguments and all the rest, but all of them and the religious traditions at their best that they represented were able to sort of slip free of a kind of right versus left clash in which they were captives of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party alone. So what happened to that center? Well, there's a long-winded version that you can find in my second-to-last book, but the short version is basically four things happened. First, the sexual revolution, which created a big gap that hadn't existed before between what you might call middle-class morality, bourgeois sexual ethics, what suburban parents expected their kids to do, and New Testament traditional religious sexual ethics. There was always tension between the two, but prior to the sexual revolution, there was a consensus that, if you got a girl pregnant, you were supposed to marry her, and you might have sex before marriage, but it would be actually premarital sex in the sense that you would probably marry the first person you slept with, and divorce was relatively rare, and homosexuality and same-sex marriage weren't even subjects for debate. And all of that ended, basically, in a relatively short time period with the development of the birth control pill and the divorce revolution and then the gay rights revolution after that. And this created a dynamic where there was a gap between what Christianity had traditionally taught and the way Americans live now, and the churches couldn't agree what to do about it, and so they fell to fighting amongst themselves, liberal Christians versus conservative Christians, Reform Jews against Orthodox Jews, arguing internally and sort of losing their hold on the cultural center as they did. So there was sex, and then there was money. America, from the 50s onward, became rich to an extent that no human civilization has ever been rich before. And with money, in the same way, not in so direct a way, but in the same way that there were tensions between post-sexual revolution culture and, let's say, the New Testament, there were also obvious and increasing tensions between a lot of traditional ideas and traditional Christian ideas, Catholic or Calvinist, depending on which tradition you wanted to pick, about austerity and renunciation and so on. Ideas that were more in tune with a society coming out of the Great Depression and weren't really in tune with a society defined by mass affluence. And in a softer way than the sexual revolution, that too weakened institutional Christianity. And then there was the effect of partisan polarization, where the fact that you had this sorting of the two political parties that used to be big, complicated coalitions with conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans into the ruthless ideological machines we know today, that inevitably had an effect on the churches, and it made it harder and harder to sort of define yourself as a Christian first and a conservative second. Instead, you were a conservative Christian or a liberal Christian, and your identity was subsumed into partisanship. And again, the churches lost their hold on the center. And then finally, and this is sort of ongoing to the present day, I think revolutions in communications technology and information technology, television, and obviously the internet beyond that beamed the dizzying diversity of the planet into Americans' consciousness as sort of never before, created not atheism, not even secularism per se, but just a kind of inevitable relativism, a feeling that religion might be good and interesting and important, but your local Methodist church couldn't possibly have any kind of monopoly on the truth. The world was just too big and complicated for that. And that in turn created the religious culture we have now, with this, this strong emphasis on sort of do-it-yourself, individualistic religion as a natural response to, again, the sheer complexity of the world and the unlikeliness or the seeming unlikeliness that one church could have a monopoly on the truth. So that's sort of what happened. Those are the forces that undercut that old sort of small O orthodox, small c conservative Christian consensus that still existed, in certain ways existed in a stronger sense because of the post-war religious revival in 1955 or so. And they delivered us to the landscape that I'm going to describe today, where I think American religion is divided into three main religious tendencies. I won't call them traditions because that's too strong, but three broad tendencies that interact with each other, conflict with each other, but basically define the religious landscape today. The first I'm going to call secular, the second spiritual, and the third biblical. And these are all very imperfect names, as you'll see, but they're the best I can come up with. So let's start with the secular religious tendency, which I know sounds slightly like a contradiction in terms. This is the narrowest category. It has the fewest actual people in it, but it's incredibly important because it's the dominant worldview of the intelligentsia, the intellectual and academic elite, the people who teach at fine universities like this one perhaps, and work for elite law firms and inhabit the commanding heights of culture and even perhaps mostly write for the New York Times. So, what is this sort of secular world picture? Well, I would describe it as a picture that combines a very strong faith in the certainties of science, the role of science in sort of the advancement of human knowledge, and the role of science as sort of a final arbiter of truth, with a pretty deep, not hostility, but skepticism about institutional religion and its claims, an even deeper skepticism about anything that seems overtly supernatural, the idea of a personal God, of divine messengers coming in and intervening in human history. And then a kind of Whiggish, optimistic, progressive conception of history in which there's some kind of arc in which things are supposed to get better and we're supposed to advance to higher and higher levels of consciousness and leave the darkness of the past behind. And then finally, a very intense ethical and moral picture organized around human rights and a version of the social gospel, a kind of reforming Christianity with the theological content drained away. So basically, all of the ethical and moral ideas that a liberal Protestant clergyman in 1895 or 1935 would have held, but without a belief in not just the resurrection of Jesus, but any of the sort of theological scaffolding. Now, this world picture encompasses, sort of actual militant atheists and strident anti-religion writers. It encompasses Richard Dawkins, it encompasses Neil deGrasse Tyson and other figures and so on, but it isn't defined by that kind of atheism. That's a minority thread. It's anti-clerical in many cases, but it's not anti-religious. It admires certain religious figures if they seem to be participating in the progressive arc of history. It particularly admires the Black church, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and so on. And it's relatively open to what you might call the pragmatic case for spirituality, the idea that religious rituals and practices have value to health and well-being, civic life, and so on. And it's especially interested in religious practices that seem like, hey, they might have some scientific warrant, some evidence from brain scans that backs up the principles of transcendental meditation or yogic breathing or what have you. Among the litany of new atheist intellectuals, right, this group that included Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and others, I think the most important figure is a writer many of you may have heard of named Sam Harris, who started his career in a blaze of militant atheism, attacking conservative Christianity and fundamentalist Islam and so on, but has proceeded, as time has gone on, to get really interested in the science of spirituality and has spent a lot of time arguing that you can be a kind of scientifically literate spiritual person, seeking out meditative experiences, maybe taking hallucinogenic drugs, achieving higher states of consciousness, as long as you don't go in for all that Old Testament nonsense in Leviticus and the idea of a literal resurrection and so on and all the rest. And I think he, in that sense, more than Hitchens or others like that, is actually a kind of representative figure of this world picture, with its interest in the spiritual, so long as it's sort of grounded in a kind of materialist understanding of the cosmos. But that grounding is really important because the secular world picture rejects revelation explicitly, anything too overtly supernatural. Meditation is fine if it has brain science behind it, but if you have a visit from an angel while you're praying, that's probably insane. So the secular world picture is, as I said, extremely intellectually influential and potent. Its main problem is that it's incoherent. Because the ethics, this is not a value judgment, it's just a statement. The ethics, the sort of Whig progressive teleology, doesn't match the kind of hard Darwinist materialism that lies at the bottom of its general portrait of the universe. And by this, I don't mean just belief in the theory of evolution. I mean a kind of more all-encompassing Darwinian sense that the material world is all you need and all you can seek out to explain consciousness, human experience, and so on. Which means that, basically the world picture has a kind of is-ought problem, where the universe it describes doesn't seem to justify the moral picture and the political idealism and all the rest that it wants to advance. And there are attempts, these are smart people, there are attempts to square this circle. There are claims are made for utilitarianism as a way to do that, claims for a kind of Darwinian ethics, claims that if we just figure out why our brains evolved to be moral, that this would somehow justify liberal moral claims. But I don't think it ever quite gets where it wants to go. Because if you listen to believers in this world picture, they are still religious moralists at heart. They aren't just making some technical argument about, if we add all these greatest good, quantiles up or something, or it's all just, we want to be in tune with our adaptive behaviors and we're adapted for altruism and so on. No. At bottom, they think moral facts are real facts. Moral absolutes are real absolutes. I think this is very apparent if you listen to almost any liberal argument in the age of Donald Trump, who has provoked a strident religious moralism among the most secular of Americans. And the problem is just that they don't have a metaphysical world picture in which those facts make sense. And I think they're comfortable with that in part because at a conscious or subconscious level, they feel like we went through in the 20th century attempts to really forge a fully post-Christian, fully post-biblical religion, world picture, morality, political ethics, and so on. And that ended up leading us towards National Socialism on the one hand and Stalinist communism on the other hand. And those were big mistakes. So, in the words of Hilaire Belloc, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. And nurse is basically this somewhat incoherent combination of residual Christianish morality with a sort of harder materialism in the world picture. So that's the secular world picture. Then you have the spiritual picture, which, like the secular world picture, is skeptical of traditional forms of religion, especially of hierarchy and obedience and binding revelations and the like. But unlike the secular world picture, it's very open to a wide range of personal religious experiences. It's open to the concept of an interventionist God, an active supernatural realm, open to lots of older religious ideas, in fact, so long as they can be reframed and reshaped for a more individualist age, stripped of too much dogmatism and mixed and matched to fit the way we live right now. So the spiritual worldview has red state and blue state varieties. It has Joel Osteen's prosperity gospel and Jordan Peterson's Jungian biblical whatever he's doing for conservatives and Republicans and so on. And it has Oprah Winfrey and Eckhart Tolle and Eat, Pray, Love for blue staters, liberals and Democrats. But then it also cuts across lines of race and partisanship. Blacks and Hispanics as well as whites respond to prosperity preaching. The prosperity gospel is the most multi-ethnic religious tradition, arguably, in American life. Lots of Republican suburban women like Oprah's Power of Positive Thinking religious revival tours. And some of the spiritual traditions or tendencies, variations, are explicitly churched. Seeker-sensitive megachurches fall into this spiritual category. The de facto, spiritual Unitarianism of a lot of the declining mainline Protestant churches. And it also has strong influences within what are often thought of as conservative institutional forms of Christianity. A certain kind of liberal Catholicism can lean in this direction. So do some forms of more progressive evangelicalism. But then at the same time, a lot of its influence is explicitly and totally deinstitutionalized and taking the form of New Age, spirituality, self-help religion, a personalized sort of approach that people mix in Eastern religion, environmental spirituality, neo-paganism, and all manners of overtly non-Christian and post-Christian forms. And then it also, I think, has some overlap, right, with the part of the secular world picture I was describing that's really interested in scientifically valid spiritual practices. That's the place where the spiritual and secular world picture overlap. And the sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, has dubbed this tendency moralistic therapeutic deism, which is a very cumbersome way of saying that it's a belief in a God who loves you and is there to help you and otherwise doesn't bother you very much. He's sort of a cosmic butler there to deal with your issues and doesn't make too many demands. That's his line. The line that I used in my book on American heresy, I called this the religion of the God within. It's the idea that if you go down to your innermost self, you won't find original sin and total depravity. You will find the divine spark that you need to be in tune with, and once you find yourself in tune with it, then you'll be in tune with whatever God himself or herself happens to be. And, again, this is a very old tradition in American life. It's the most American religious tradition in certain ways. It goes back to Emerson and all the way down to Norman Vincent Peale. And it has, I think, a lot of influence on our political leaders in interesting different ways. I think, President Obama, in certain ways, his liberal style of Christianity sometimes tiptoed in this direction. When he would be quoted saying, he'd be asked to define sin, and he would say, well, sin is being out of alignment with my values. It's a very God within kind of statement. And then Donald Trump, interestingly, Trump is, I think, has passed beyond religion in a certain way, but his actual religious roots are with Norman Vincent Peale and sort of power of positive thinking Christianity. So in a sense, he is a sort of secularized version of the prosperity gospel, God wants you to be rich and successful and awesome and have amazing hair combed across your head school of theology. And because this is sort of pop spirituality, it often gets dismissed by religious intellectuals, but I think it has often a real internal logic. Even something like the prosperity gospel, which gets sneered at roundly, there's a reason that it's so appealing to so many people. It tells a very clear story that resolves a lot of the quandaries that other religious traditions just have to live with, like the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people and all the rest? Prosperity theology says it's all about, whether you are in tune with God, whether you're praying in the right way, praying hard enough, and so on. And if you are, you will be rewarded. And if you are not, you will not be rewarded. And the good people are rewarded and the bad people aren't. And you can tell who's getting rewarded. You can tell who's good and bad because who's getting rewarded and who's not. And it all makes sense. So it has a coherence. But at the same time, it obviously has a major weakness, which is its shallowness and its inability to sort of wrestle with contradiction and tension and all of the deep dilemmas that the older religious traditions were much more likely to wrestle with. So that worldview is basically the new religious center. If there was a religious center in 1955, somewhere in between Reinhold Niebuhr and Fulton Sheen and Billy Graham, there's a religious center in 2018, somewhere in between Joel Osteen, Jordan Peterson, Oprah Winfrey, and Elizabeth Gilbert of Eat, Pray, Love. That's what the center is now. It's the common ground that our politicians are most likely to appeal to if they ever appeal to common ground. It's the place where you find religious figures who aren't defined by partisanship. In spite of Oprah's minor dabbling in democratic politics, she's still seen as a religious figure first and a partisan figure second. And it is, because it's the center, it's sort of the bridge between the secular world picture and the third picture I'm going to talk about, the biblical one. And that's a really imperfect name because it includes traditional Jews and Muslims as well as conservative Christians. It doesn't account for, where Mormons and the Book of Mormon fit in and all the rest. But it gets, I think, at the central thing uniting this tradition, which is the belief in a binding revelation, a tradition or authority that's more important than just the individual's relationship with the divine. That could be the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. It could be, in the case of my own Catholic Church, sacred scripture as interpreted by popes and the magisterium. But the essential idea, which is alien to the other two religious cultures in America, is that the individual should ultimately seek to conform himself or herself to a truth already revealed and interpreted, rather than treating religion as a therapeutic practice that provides for happiness in the here and now, or a quest for the God that lives deep within yourself. And the best way to think about this distinction is to take, how many of you have either seen the movie or read the book Eat, Pray, Love? Okay, so that's not a bad percentage. So for those of you who haven't, it is sort of the equivalent of Augustine's Confessions or Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain for our time, basically. It's a story of a religious pilgrimage by a woman who starts out sort of in the secular world picture and is unhappy in her marriage and miserable in her sort of professional Western life. And she goes to Italy for the food, not the Catholicism, the food. And then she goes to India and has incredible, I think, totally authentic religious experiences in an ashram that sort of radically reorient her spiritual life. And then she goes on to Brazil, to Bali, and finds love in the arms of a handsome Brazilian divorcee. And what happens in that book is a quest for God. What doesn't happen in that book is a surrender to a tradition. So it's as if Augustine, at the end of the Confessions, had sort of cobbled together his own mixture of Christianity, paganism, and Manichaeanism, and said, "This is great, and now I get to go back to my mistress and live happily ever after." Or if Merton, at the end of the Seven-Story Mountain, had not gone into a monastery, but had gone off to a tropical resort and had a really great time. So, Gilbert has in real spiritual experiences in India, but she doesn't convert to Hinduism or Buddhism or any Eastern tradition. She just sort of brings pieces of that together with her own Protestant background and creates essentially a sort of God within spiritual picture, world picture for herself. That's the heart of the spiritual versus biblical distinction, I think. It's not the presence of the religious quest, the religious drive. It's not supernatural experience. It's whether you end in submitting in some sense to a larger tradition or doing it yourself. And the biblical tradition then is interestingly sort of concentrated. It's clearly not the center anymore. It's concentrated in certain ways on both extremes in our politics. It's much stronger in the conservative coalition than the liberal coalition, but because it's still powerful in the black church and among Hispanics and other minority groups, you do have a piece of the biblical world picture that's aligned with the otherwise more secular liberal coalition as well. But then at the same time, it's not just sort of on the extremes. Its influence is weak, and over the last 10 or 15 years, especially getting weaker. It's very weak in democratic politics, which are primarily defined by a kind of alliance between the secular and the spiritual world pictures, with very little time for the most uncomfortable parts of the biblical tradition. But then it's also weaker than it used to be in the GOP. I think you can see the rise of Trump himself as sort of the part, as connected to the eclipse of thoroughgoing, comprehensive religious practice and belief in part of the Republican coalition. Donald Trump started out in the primaries with intense support from evangelicals who didn't go to church, which is basically a group of voters much closer ultimately to the sort of spiritual do-it-yourself side of Christianity than the more orthodox or biblical side. And he sort of built his coalition out from there, but his victory wouldn't have been possible, I think, in a Republican Party that was as shaped by the biblical tradition as a lot of people thought it was going into 2016. And then the biblical picture is, I mentioned the weaknesses of the other two world pictures. I think, since I'm a partisan of it, I tend to think that it's more coherent than the sexual world picture. Its ethics actually match its metaphysics, and it's richer and deeper than the spiritual picture, with more to say about suffering and complexity and all the rest. But it clearly has weaknesses as well, or it wouldn't be in such decline. It's seen by the secular as too irrational, insufficiently scientific, constantly wrestling with conflicts between the theory of evolution and earlier interpretations of the Bible, or between the doctrine of original sin and what we seem to know from evolution about our first parents and so on. Those are sort of unresolved tensions. And then it's seen by both the secular and the spiritual as too morally unrealistic, as sort of out of touch with the patterns of life now, and at worst as intolerant, bigoted, cruel to the divorced, to gay people, to other groups who are sort of excluded from its sort of, or seem to be excluded from its vision of human flourishing. So those are the weaknesses. And then to get to the actual sort of framework of this talk, polarization, I think it's useful to see a lot of our culture war battles as basically the biblical side tugging in one direction, the secular side tugging in another direction, and the battles being resolved by how the spiritual center thinks about things, right? So the spiritual center, because it's residually Christian, is deeply conflicted about abortion, and so the abortion debate remains a live issue sort of permanently in our politics. On the other hand, same-sex marriage ended up fitting in so neatly with the kind of God within, be true to yourself perspective of the spiritual center, that its sort of conservative, traditional, biblical critics ended up totally isolated, cut off from the mainstream of American society, and simply lost that debate. And then debates over religious liberty tend to go back and forth, sort of depending on who's seen as the victim and who's seen as the aggressor. Again, because the spiritual center has a skepticism about institutional religion and traditional morality, but also a certain sympathy for the religion of its youth, its Christmas and Easter church-going, the spiritual works from it which people find comfort and so on. And so it doesn't want to live in a world where the secular side is just rolling over traditional institutional religion, but it also doesn't want to live in a world where traditional religion gets to set the rules of the game anymore. So basically, whoever is seen as the more persecuted tends to end up attracting the sympathy of that middle. So that's sort of how this maps onto the culture wars. But then how it maps onto polarization generally is it creates a landscape where the religious center is really weak. It's big, it's potent in its influence in certain ways, but it doesn't have the sort of, it doesn't have the kind of richness and rigor and institutional form, right? Because institutional forms themselves, actual churches, actual congregations, and so on, are tremendously important to civic life. And when your center doesn't have that going for it, it's not surprising that it's hard for anyone, a politician, an intellectual, anyone else, to sort of organize from the center, because there's only jello there, basically. So that's sort of my view of the downside, if you will, of this particular religious arrangement, independent of what you think about sort of the theological truth of the different factions. It sort of enables polarization by creating a space in the center that just doesn't give would-be centrists a lot to work with. So finally, quickly, some speculation. How might this landscape change? I want to throw out 4 possibilities. The first is sort of a continuation of present trends, the continued collapse of the biblical tradition into spiritual individualism, basically, which would mean basically more and more people sort of ceasing to practice religion while remaining residually attached to it, the existing churches sort of liberalizing and becoming more individualist in certain ways. I think at least part of Roman Catholicism under Pope Francis imagines that it needs to go in this direction. And that's basically sort of the trends of the last 10 years continue apace, in which case you're headed in a direction much more like Europe circa 1995, where the biblical world picture and traditional religion becomes a kind of crankish fringe that's sort of cut off from larger political debates, which become less informed by religion, which may sound like a good thing to lots of secular liberals, but in fact can lead to a more racially or tribally polarized politics, because you lose any sense of religious common ground, and people define themselves more and more through other forms of identity politics, partisan polarization, and so on. So that's scenario 1. Scenario 2 is a revival of the biblical side via the conversion of the spiritual, basically. So you have a huge swath of American life that is half secularized, that's still really interested in Jesus of Nazareth and still believes in miracles and the power of prayer and the afterlife and all the rest. And that seems like potentially fertile mission territory for the dynamic churches that over the last 40 or 50 years we've conspicuously lacked. And it seems even more like potential mission territory when you consider that this middle is, in part because of the retreat of organized religion, experiencing a kind of social collapse, which is most vivid in the Rust Belt and in the opioid epidemic, but is present all over and reflects the fact that, it's not just religion, not just institutional religion in decline, it's family and civic life and so on. You have more and more people basically growing old and dying alone on their own. And that's a problem of community, and it's a problem that, again, a dynamic institutional religion offers not just a theological answer to, but a practical answer to. And I don't think there's any necessary reason why that couldn't provide the grounds at some point for a kind of, a sort of religious revival emerging out of the biblical side of things. Third possibility is the revival of the biblical side of things via the conversion of the elites. It is extremely unlikely seeming, but not entirely impossible because history is full of weird, bizarre happenings, that the sort of internal incoherence that I've described of the secular world picture could lead to some sort of intellectual great awakening in the most secular part of American society. Again, wild speculation, very unlikely, not entirely impossible. But then finally, there's a fourth possibility, which is basically that internal tension and contradiction in the secular world picture gets resolved through the emergence of a new post-Christian elite religious consensus that works with that sort of sidelines biblical religion, traditional Christianity, traditional Judaism, and so on, works a little more of the supernaturalism of the spiritual center in, isn't quite as sort of rigorously materialistic in its metaphysical premises, and goes in a direction that maybe is more Buddhist. A book like Robert Wright's recent book, Why Buddhism is True, which I recommend to anyone interested in the subject, was an incredibly popular book with a certain segment of really smart people interested in these things, and it provided an interesting argument for how Buddhism and Eastern religion generally could become more than just sort of a hobby of the American elite, I think, but could become something more potent than that. Or maybe it's a neo-paganism or a pantheism that starts with, there was a book written by the philosopher Thomas Nagel called Mind and Cosmos that critiqued neo-Darwinian materialism from a philosophical perspective while rejecting religious orthodoxy, and ended up arguing for pantheism, or some version where God and the universe are sort of coterminous. Or there was a book by the former dean of Yale Law School that made a long and I think somewhat similar argument for a revival of paganism in the modern world. And all of this sounds, again, these are wild speculations. These are sort of interesting intellectual currents. But I think there is potentially something there where the incoherence in the secular world picture could be resolved in a way that doesn't involve going back to Christianity or traditional Western monotheism, but involves something that as yet we don't understand. And so that's where I'll finish up with a claim that the future of America is almost certainly religious, but how the current three religious worldviews change and interact going forward is a matter where wild speculation is probably going to be close to the truth. It's just a question of which wild speculation it will be. So thank you all so very much.
I'm now joined, as I mentioned, by Professor Tracy Fessenden. She is the interim director of the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at ASU. Just a brief biography. She holds the Forster Professorship in the Faculty of Religious Studies. Her work focuses on gender, race, and sexuality in American religious history, also American religion in relation to literature and the arts, and religion in relation to American law and public life. Among her published works are two books, Religion Around Billie Holiday and Culture and Redemption, Religion, the Secular, and American Literature. And also two co-edited books, The Puritan Origins of American Sex, Religion, Sexuality, and National Identity in American Literature, and Religion, the Secular, and the Politics of Sexual Difference. So I will begin with a question, and then I'll turn it over to Tracy to ask some questions. The disappearance of a political center, you might say, certainly among elites, is one way of describing this phenomenon of negative partisanship, polarization. And I wonder if an old idea that was raised in the discussion last night about civil religion is another way to get at your description of this disintegration into these three different approaches to religion. And the older or original civil religion binding together in some ways American political and social differences. So there was still some common discourse and vocabulary. That really was religious. I mean, there was a metaphysical element to that.
Right.
And the, so in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature and nature's God, or Martin Luther King being
Right.
Jr. in not only in 1963, but right before his death, able to put together Christian faith with the Declaration and the Constitution. The disappearance of that, the collapse of a genuinely metaphysical foundation for a civil religion, is that another way of describing the disintegration and into polarization that you're talking about?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I guess I would frame it. Maybe it's similar, but I mean, I think we still have a civil religion. It just has lost its institutional and theological scaffolding. Like, I mean, I think I'm being entirely sincere. I think Oprah Winfrey embodies American civil religion. Then, this sort of, a sort of gospel of self-help, human equality, tolerance. I mean, a lot of sort of good values and so on. But it has lost its connection to sort of, I mean, originally to Protestant Christianity. And, I mean, if you read Letter from Birmingham Jail, right, like King is giving a sort of theological master class. He's pulling in, Aquinas and the Reformation. And so, I mean, there's a sense of sort of a real, an actual historical theological tradition behind it. And now, one of the questions I think that we have to wrestle with in this moment is, to what extent was that inevitable, right? Was it, can you sort of sustain a religious tradition, a civic religion permanently, or does the sort of liberal project dissolve it in certain ways, right? Like, at a certain point, was it just inevitable? I mean, this is Patrick Deneen, who I think is coming here in a little while, has written a book called How Liberalism Failed, that basically I think would argue that like, civil religion inevitably gets more and more attenuated the further it gets from institutional religion and traditional theology, and we've just reached the point where it's too attenuated to sort of work and bind us together. I'm not totally convinced of that. I mean, I think what you see in American history is more sort of like a wave pattern, where you have institutional churches get weaker, the country gets more divided, civil religion weakens too, and then you have revivals and great awakenings and so on that sort of rebuild the basis for that consensus. The problem in our era is just that it's been a long time now since the last time that happened. And in certain ways, you could think of like the 60s and 70s as a great awakening that dissolved and then nobody rebuilt things. And that's sort of what we're missing. We're missing sort of an institutional, theologically serious correlative to what, without it, is a pretty thin and sometimes, sincere, well-meaning, but insipid civil religiosity.
Thank you, Russ. I so appreciated your talk. Paul and I were chatting beforehand, trying to predict what you would say. We were trying to guess what these three parts of American religious life would be. And what we came up with was something like the old culture wars model, religious conservatives plus religious liberals plus religious nuns. And what you've given us, I think, is much more nuanced and rich, and I'm very, very appreciative. I have a question. It's a two-part question about where the intellectual energy resides in this three-part schema. In your description, the only intellectuals in this picture are really the secularists, the smallest band in this three-part configuration. If that's the case, what happened between Niebuhr and King and Billy Graham was an intellectually serious theologian, intellectually serious about the Bible, Fulton Sheen as well. Those were the four names that I tagged. What was it? You've given us four things that happened: the sexual revolution, capital, political polarization, and the communications revolution. What made it the case that no more intellectual energy sort of flowed into these theological and biblical pursuits in your picture? Why is it, and I'm not sure I entirely agree with you, But why is it that you see the only intellectual energy in America's three-part religious world as residing with secularists? And
Well,
what
so-
can we do as educators? I teach religious
Right.
studies. We're trying to spread some of the intellectual energy around. So what would you suggest?
Well,
as a-
first, I think I have a low opinion of intellectual energy in America generally. I don't want to single out anyone, but my sense in general is that, like, when I talk about this sort of unresolved contradiction in the secular world picture, I think it's unresolved in part because there's a lot of sort of complacency and stagnation everywhere in American society. I sort of, this is my idiosyncratic view, but I think people who talk about our era as an era of dizzying change and transformation are actually wrong, and that the era of dizzying change and transformation ended around 1975 or 1985, and that we've been sort of going in circles ever since. So I think it's a general problem, not just a sort of religious problem, but I think the religious side of it is basically, those forces that I described, and I think above all for religious intellectuals, sort of the sexual revolution, but all, connected to that, arguments about historical criticism of the Bible and so on, they basically ended up dividing religious and particularly Christian intellectual life internally into these two warring camps that basically said, well, we have these problems, these challenges, how are we going to resolve them? And the conservatives said, well, we're going to resolve them by, making some adaptive moves, but basically sticking with the old synthesis. And the liberals said, no, we're going to revive them. We're going to get through them by coming to a new synthesis that sort of, incorporates feminism and gay rights and everything that happened from the 60s onward and revisits, New Testament texts and so on. And those two groups basically fought themselves to a standstill that we've been stuck in ever since. And, as a Catholic, I know the Catholic landscape the best, but one of the striking things about the Catholic landscape, right, is that, in the age of Pope Francis, we've had a revival of sort of 1970s era clashes over the future of Catholicism, basically. Sort of John Paul II and Benedict tried to they did their part to try and resolve some of these arguments. They sort of offered a conservative Christianity that they thought sort of incorporated the Second Vatican Council, but also was continuous with what went before. They said, well, we've resolved it and so on. And then Francis has reopened it, and it's clear it wasn't resolved. This debate is exactly where it was in 1975, except in 1975, the people having this argument were titans of theology, right? Like, Joseph Ratzinger and Karol Wojtyla, the two conservative popes, were great intellects. And so were, Karl Rahner and Hans Kung and all of these theological giants of what we think of as sort of liberal Catholicism. Today, we're having exactly the same arguments, except it's hack journalists like me arguing with hack journalists who wrote biographies of Pope Francis. And meaning no disrespect to journalists, but it's pretty bizarre that this is sort of, instead of theological titans clashing, we're having, pundits basically having the same kind of argument. So I think, the baseline is you have a question for traditional religion, Christianity especially. How do you respond to the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s? How do you move forward? How do you synthesize and transcend? And nobody knows. Nobody has, people have models, but none of the models seem to work. The liberal churches tried their model and went into steep decline. The conservative churches tried their model and sort of built a bunker and told themselves they had succeeded, but they just sort of stagnated and slipped away too. And this is, I think, your mission as an educator and as an academic and as an intellectual is to encourage people to figure it out, right? To say, we need, in theology, we need a synthesis that is, you need a liberal synthesis that would be persuasive, maybe not to me, but to someone a little less conservative than me who could be brought along. Or you need a conservative synthesis that could, be persuasive and also sort of seem to map onto people's lives. That I think is what's missing, and it's the biggest reason why you've sort of descended from the age of Niebuhr. Niebuhr wasn't writing about the sexual revolution, right? He was writing before any of these things happened, and so he could sort of assume a relative unity that had been recreated, right? Had to be sort of after the modernist fundamentalist controversies in the 30s, sort of his project was to, in part, to sort of recreate a kind of partial unity in high Protestant thought. But you can't have a Niebuhr today because nobody knows what he'd say, I think. I think that's the problem.
Yeah. Follow up?
Okay, I'm gonna stick with this issue of the sexual revolution that Niebuhr didn't address or anticipate. One of the reasons that the old culture wars model for thinking about American religion is looking dated to me and to some of my colleagues is that that model sees gender and sexuality as a fault line between opposing sides, but not within the various sides themselves. And I think what we're seeing now is that the Me Too movement, for example, is as transformative a disturbance in conservative religious circles as it is in liberal circles, as it is in secular circles. And I'm missing in your predictions for the future any sense of what might happen as that ferment continues. I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Amy Sullivan, who shared with me that among evangelical women, there is a sense of deep betrayal on the part of many of these women for whom sexual morality for them was a cherished value, was something that they were rewarded for nurturing, for cultivating, for prioritizing in their lives and the lives of their families. And so there's a sense of deep betrayal on the part of some of these women in churches which have gone so entirely over to the side of Donald Trump. And as women in these organizations are speaking out, often in off-the-record kinds of venues, often in internet kinds of conversations that are huge. Some of these women have huge followings. It looks like something interesting is happening. And I think that those interesting things are happening in all three of your groups. And so I'm just wondering, as you think about the future, as you predict possible ways in which this might go, how might this iteration of the sexual revolution influence the future that you imagine, or the futures that you imagine?
So I'll try and fit it into two of my possible scenarios, right? So here's my, as a, some kind of conservative Christian, here's my optimist scenario, right? That in this ferment that you're describing, there is the possibility for a conservative Christianity that in certain ways remains conservative, but takes the real insights of feminism more seriously than it has to date, and basically figures out a way to sort of sift the sexual revolution, you might say, and to say, critiques of sexism in the church and so on were correct, but we're still pro-life. And I mean, that's sort of just one example, but basically figures out a way to say, we aren't just selling the patriarchy of 1940 or 1540 for that matter. We're selling a religion that has sort of retained its core moral commitments while also accepting, the landscape that the advancement of women won, basically. And this is the sort of, the crude political heuristic for this is my desire that Amy Coney Barrett, rather than Brett Kavanaugh, had been the nominee for the Supreme Court. The idea of sort of the successful professional female, keen legal mind, who is also the mother of a large family, as sort of the model for how conservative Christianity presents itself, rather than the accused rapist from Georgetown Prep, right? Now, you may have noticed that Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court and Amy Coney Barrett is not, which then I'll use that to segue into my, again, from a sort of conservative Christian perspective, pessimistic scenario, which is that part of what we're seeing in the Me Too moment is the further polarization of the genders, where you have, and this maps onto partisan polarization. The Republican Party, the gender gap has widened dramatically. The Republican, it was already pretty wide. And it used to be that there was a marriage gap where married women were more likely to vote Republican and single women voted for Democrats. But you can imagine if married women trending Democratic too, and so you have sort of politicized gender divides within the home itself. And we're also living in a culture where the sexes generally seem to be having more trouble mating and pairing off and so on. Marriage rates are low, birth rates are low, all the rest. So you could imagine a world in which that continues and the kind of spiritual center that I've described becomes polarized by gender, as I think it already is in certain ways. So you have a kind of male spiritual but not religious thing, and a female spiritual but not religious thing, and neither the twain shall meet. There's no synthesis. It's Jordan Peterson acolytes over there and Elizabeth Gilbert readers over there, and so the center itself becomes polarized by gender, and there's no room for sort of a post-feminist Christianity in that matrix, and it's just sort of, it just gets worse, basically. So those are two scenarios provoked by your very interesting question.
Okay, and with that, we have a microphone here, and we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. I would ask that, this is an idea I've borrowed from John Carlson, Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict here at ASU. A brief question should be brief and should be a question, not a statement. So if we would follow those
as long as
two.
you raise your voice at the end, it'll come across as a question.
I was wondering that since the early centuries of our country, it was biblically based, and I would assume now that in the public schools it's not biblically based. There seems to be a sense of illiteracy about Bible and Bible concepts and individuals. What should the public schools, particularly in high school, be doing about this? I know at the college level you have great programs in religion that are available, but what about for those, even in the elementary school, other than going to a private school, many people don't have access to this kind of education. Just wondering, is there a solution to that kind of situation?
That's a really good question. The question was about sort of the role of biblical literacy and sort of the eclipse of the Bible as a kind of common cultural book, and what public schools can do about it. And I don't honestly know, because the challenge is, getting back sort of to your question about civil religion, like you can't fake it, right? You can't, I absolutely support exposing kids more to the Bible in public school. But our public schools are secularized and likely to remain so. And teaching the Bible as literature to, fifth graders for, an hour a day or something it's never going to put the Bible back in the cultural place that it occupied in American life down to the 1960s and 1970s. So in that sense, I don't, if you like the idea of an American culture that treats the Bible as, a common cultural property that people of different denominations and different political views can draw on, and we are absolutely losing that. Like the scale of biblical illiteracy when it just comes to sort of obvious Bible quotes among extremely well-educated people is staggering. The public schools aren't going to fix that. Only the churches can fix that. The only way you get that is, they can fix it through their schools. They can fix it by reviving and improving religious private education in this country to a point where it becomes something that actually instills biblical literacy again. But ultimately, it's up to the people who really believe in the Bible to make the Bible relevant again. You're not, if you get to a point where there is serious treatment of the Bible in the public schools, it will be because the Bible has already become more culturally relevant again, and only, people who genuinely believe in it and aren't just trying to sort of cobble together a civic consensus. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but only that is going to get you where you want to go. Yes.
Your experience and my experience, and probably most of us, how you end up religiously depends on how you were raised. Do you think going forward with like today's information technology that how you end up will be less influenced by your family and more by information technology or some other impact, going forward rather than how you were raised?
That's a really, I mean, I didn't really talk much about the internet, but I think the question about information technology is really interesting and important. And, you know, it doesn't seem entirely like a coincidence that sort of the trends of the last 10 years away from sort of institutional affiliations and towards more of this sort of spiritual but not religious or spiritual but semi-religious stuff have coincided with the rise of the internet, because the internet is sort of the ultimate, you know, do-it-yourself, cobble it together yourself kind of thing. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if both that there was more religious switching in the age of the internet, but also just that there was sort of more like, more sort of personalized religion and less sort of maintenance of denominational traditions. Now, with that being said, the internet does also build sort of more extreme religious communities, like, you know, it sort of encourages people who share weird ideas to find each other in ways that they wouldn't have been able to find each other before. You know, on Twitter, which is the social media platform that I use, there is this piece of Catholic Twitter that is called Weird Catholic Twitter. And Weird Catholic Twitter is very weird indeed, and also very interesting and entertaining. And if I were a religious seeker in the internet world, I would either be extremely repelled by it or strangely attracted to it. And I think that that's true within other religious traditions as well. So it may be that there'll be a period where the internet contributes to sort of continuing dissolution of sort of inherited denominational ties, but that somewhere on the internet are being forged these sort of new religious networks that will create the weird, unexpected religious transformations of 2055.
So I wanted to ask, because you gave the example of Europe and how the biblical religion has kind of been relegated to a fringe there. And
Western Europe, I think, is
Western Europe,
a fair
I should
way
say,
of putting it.
So it seems like it's kind of the middle ground spiritual religion against the secularism, and it looks to me, and I think a lot of people, like secularism is kind of winning, kind of growing there. But in your vision for the U.S., you think it's going to remain very religious still. I think some people kind of have this idea that maybe it's just like Europe, but not further along yet. But would you disagree with that? And what factors do you think contribute to the differences between European and American religious development?
I mean, I think America has always been more comfortable with religious individualism and religious freelancing, and European Christianity has been more, you know, even in Protestant countries, you have established churches, there's much more historically kind of often enforced religious conformity. And so what that means, I think, in Europe is that as institutional religion declines, people are more likely to identify as just secular, whereas in America we have this long-standing, you know, Emerson to Christian Science to, you know, just sort of all of these different sort of sects and sort of personalized religious tendencies, transcendentalism and so on springing up, that there's a more natural American comfort with the idea that, like, I may not be associated with a church, but I'm still religious. So that I think is part of the difference. There is also, though, a lot of similarity. Like if you drill down beneath the secularism of Europe, you find a lot of what I'm describing as the spiritual world picture. You find a lot of belief in astrology and beliefs in afterlives and prayer and all of these things that are sort of not expressed as religion, but are effectively still spiritual beliefs. So Europe's secularization is a little bit overrated. But the most important thing about European politics is that what has happened with the eclipse of sort of the biblical world picture is just that politics has been organized less around religion, which for a while sort of worked and created this kind of technocratic center with a center right and a center left that were very similar to one another and were less polarized than American politics. 20 years ago, people looked at Europe and said, well, secularization reduces polarization probably because the Tories and the Labour Party aren't that far apart, and the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats aren't that far apart, and it all works very well. What we've seen since, though, is that the dissatisfactions, when that technocracy seems to not work anymore, and when people are sort of looking for meaning that technocracy can't supply, what you get is the return of tribalism and sort of ideological extremism of the left, of the further left and the further right, which then is exacerbated by the other thing we haven't talked about, which is Islam, the presence of a sort of a coherent Islamic challenge to the secularism of the continent. So a lot of Western European politics, it seems to me, is now defined by a polarization that isn't particularly religious, that sort of vacuums up what remains, the remains of traditional Catholicism in France gets vacuumed up partially into the National Front, and the remains of sort of a left-wing Anglicanism gets vacuumed up by Jeremy Corbyn. But that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is the return of ethnic and nationalist tribalism, and perhaps even the return of fascism and sort of a hardcore socialism as alternatives. So it's a different polarization from ours, and has the potential to be worse than ours because of the absence of strong, the greater absence of strong religious institutions.
Yeah, I see you're going in the direction of the question I was going to answer. I'm thinking more on the secular side here, and how the younger generation seems to be going more that way. And if you think that's a trend, or is that we cycle through these things, or what do you make of that?
The trend, sorry,
Is the younger generation more secular than
Yes.
religious or spiritual?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the...
I think on the evidence, yes. I think you're seeing basically young people who would have been in my biblical category trending into the spiritual category, and people who were in the spiritual category trending into the secular category. I'm just not completely sure. I think you saw a lot of that sort of 2005 to 2015. There was sort of a period of sort of accelerated change. I'm not sure that trend will necessarily continue. Often you'll get sort of sudden accelerations of trends followed by a return to the status quo. And if you look at the data on, among sort of the remains of conservative Christianity, if you look at the data on church attendance and so on, it doesn't look that unstable. It doesn't look like there's some dramatic collapse coming. So I think that's a real trend, but I'm not 100% sure it's accelerating. And I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of weird interests, radical interests among people who came of age after the Great Recession especially. And a lot of this is manifest in politics, in versions of what I was just describing in Europe. I think both sort of the appeal of the alt-right and certain forms of the socialist left reflect that, but it's also manifest in, among religious young people. There's more sort of radicalism and reactionary sentiment, and both at once sometimes. Like a big chunk of what I just called weird Catholic Twitter could be described legitimately as reactionary radicals. And I think it's just too soon to tell how all of that plays out. I think it suggests that things are maybe going to be more unsettled going forward than this period of stagnation that I'm arguing that we've been living through for the last couple generations. But it's just too soon to tell.
We actually have time for just one last question, so sorry for the folks who just joined the line, but there's a reception afterwards, so there might be...
You can hunt me down.
Yes, try and find him to
exercise
pose a question.
me.
So last question.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to actually get your thoughts on the question that was pitched before regarding the Me Too and the gender gap, and you made reference to the potential with this negative perspective on the worldviews of what might come of a widening of the gender gap, which kind of struck me because it seems to me we see this consequence of the sexual revolution has been a neutralization of the sexes, to the point that we have a man winning the women's world championship cycling. How do you see that as sort of a greater commentary on this problem that we have with relationships between the sexes? Seems to me, at least, I'd like your thoughts on it, to be more about a neutralization and not a widening of the genders. And that ties back to, if the biblical worldview is being shut out, which in a lot of ways, from my opinion, it seems that it is, from the discussion, from the conversation, the biblical worldview really does underpin it's hinged on this idea of the differences and the distinctions and the complementarity of the sexes. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So I'm not sure, right? So I think ideologically you're right. If you look at sort of the official ideology of the Western world right now, it is an ideology of gender, increasingly of gender fluidity and gender interchangeability both, right? It's the idea that that basically that differences between the sexes are not exclusively, but mostly socially conditioned relics of patriarchy and so on that need to be done away with. And then the gender itself is obviously just this construct, and there are multiple genders, and that sort of it should be normal for children to switch genders as they enter their teenage years and all the rest. So ideologically, that's what's happening. And that's what leads a lot of religious conservatives to make, I think, a version of the argument that you gestured at, basically, that this is part of the reason why the sexes aren't relating to one another as well, as that there's no sense of how they are different and complement each other. So I believe in that argument to some extent. I've made versions of that argument. But if you look at, in practice, right, okay, what do people say they believe? They increasingly believe in gender interchangeability. How are people living? In fact, there's a lot more divergence between the sexes than in past eras, right? If you look at, there's lots of fascinating research on this from Scandinavia, which is, of course, the most formally gender egalitarian society in the world. If you look at professional choices, like the jobs that men and women choose to do, the professions they go into, and so on, there's more divergence between the genders in Scandinavia than there is in developed but more theoretically traditional societies, I think like Italy or Spain or something. So it's, it's a fairly robust finding generally, that as with wealth and opportunity and so on, even legal gender egalitarianism leads to the sexes doing more different things from one another than they might have done even 20 or 25 years ago. So there's that divergence. And then, when I live in the world, right, when I look at the heterosexual men and women that I notice, I don't actually see Western culture becoming really androgynous. I see a lot of sort of performing of gender, right, and in extreme forms, right. The alt-right is sort of an extreme performance of right-wing male identity politics and so on. But even among the sort of liberal feminist young women that I know are not generally sort of dressing in 70s style, gender interchangeable clothes. They're expressing their femininity in pretty strong ways. And even something like transgenderism, right? Caitlyn Jenner is not androgynous. Caitlyn Jenner went from being Bruce Jenner, maximally macho man, to being the cover of Vanity Fair, performing femininity in the most sort of outrageous, bosomy way possible. So I feel like there's more going on here than just the conservative argument about sort of a loss of complementarity. I do feel like there's a divergence too, where conditions of freedom and a certain level of gender equality are sort of encouraging the sexes to sometimes sort of go off by themselves and be hyper female and hyper masculine in ways that might also make coming back together harder. I see a lot of this, I'm very, as a reactionary of some kind, I'm very interested in reaction in all its forms. And I see in the more toxic portions of reaction a lot of this, a lot of hyper masculinity, sort of it's not gender neutral at all, to the extent that it's destructive in its sort of response to feminism, this quest for a sort of, well, the women have taken away our power, so we're going to be, we're going to go to war with them. I mean, the culture of pickup artists, for instance, it's not a gender-neutral culture at all. It's like we're going to assume the sexes are different, and we're going to exploit every weakness we find in women. I mean, that's an important cultural fact, and it needs to be sort of assessed in tandem with this idea that sort of ideologically we're insisting that the sexes are interchangeable. On that bizarre note.
Yes. It's not actually a great setup for punch and cookies, although I think that's what we have outside. So
nothing's more gendered than punch and cookies, man.
Before I invite you to the reception, just a few closing words. So for all the students here, again, there's information outside on our courses, on the major and the minor. Please pick up the schedule events in this series, Polarization and Civil Disagreement. Next up, on October 25th, we have a terrific panel of 4 leading scholars on Alexis de Tocqueville and his classic work, Democracy in America. And the title of that event is What's Ailing Liberal Democracy? What Tocqueville Can Still Teach Us, October 25th. Also, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict and the Cronkite School here at ASU are hosting a conversation with the CNN religion reporter Daniel Burke. That's on Monday, October 29th at 7 p.m. on religion, journalism, and democracy. It's at the Cronkite School campus in downtown Phoenix, and that's free and open to the public. Thanks again to our partners here for the event. I have to say special thanks to Dr. Tracy Fessenden for joining me for the questions, Professor Charles Drummond in our school, Skettle, for helping to organize these 2 days of events on religion and politics. And as always, our terrific team of public affairs and the events and communications team in the school, especially Dr. Carol McNamara, and Tracy and Taylor and Gayla and Susan and Kim and Ty, our student workers. And with that, please join me one last time in thanking Ross Douthat.
Thank you, guys.